So here we are, the last chapter, chapter 10 of the last unit in environmental science. So we've talked about the underpinnings of agriculture, all of the pieces that we need to have working to make agriculture happen. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on ways to make agriculture sustainable. These are the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about feeding the human population. We're going to get into more detail on the Green Revolution. We're going to look at how we raise animals for food and some of the impacts. We're going to look at the importance of crop diversity. We're going to look at pollinator threats, and we're going to look at something called integrated pest management, or IPM. More things that we're going to do. There's a lot we're going to cover. We're going to talk about genetic engineering, organic agriculture, that kind of stuff. So GMOs are a big controversial issue. There's a guy named Steve Marsh. He grows organic crops. His neighbor grows Roundup ready crops. Canola is... the canola on his farm is engineered by Monsanto. So if it's Roundup ready, that means it can be sprayed with Roundup without it being harmed. It's a genetically modified organism. So when Baxter, who is the Monsanto farmer, when Baxter harvested his canola, the Monsanto canola, some of it made its way into Marsh's field, the organic field. When that happened, inspectors who came to inspect Marsh's farm said that it wasn't organic anymore because of Baxter's material in his fields. So the organic farmer sued the Monsanto farmer for his crops, and he lost, basically saying that the Monsanto farmer didn't do anything wrong, which is true. A law passed in Australia let Baxter grow them, but there was another law that said that if the crop is organic, if there's any GM material in it at all, it can't be considered organic. So this is a dilemma. And we're going to look at a piece related to this controversy when we look at our key points. So we're trying to feed the world. Industrialized agriculture has made things happen much more readily, much more efficiently, but we have issues with the kind of damage that's doing environmentally. Organic farming increases the likelihood of, decreases the likelihood of environmental impact, but it's also less efficient. So is organic farming really a solution? We have to take a look at that. So when we talk about people and access to food, you can either suffer from undernutrition, overnutrition, or malnutrition. Okay. So undernutrition is when people receive fewer calories than they require for their minimum dietary intake. Okay. Minimum caloric intake. 800 million people on the planet don't get enough calories in the course of a day. Most of those people who are undernourished live in developing countries, but about 49 million people are classified as food insecure. So basically, they don't know where their next meal is coming from. They don't have a reliable, adequate, safe, and nutritious food supply. And even here, there are quite a few people in our county, the 6th richest county in the country, who are food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. And that's scary. Food insecurity, those suffering from food insecurity, has gone down since the 1960s. What has gone up is overnutrition, okay? Receiving too many calories a day. because of cheap junk food and sedentary lifestyles. And this causes all sorts of problems: heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, other health issues. We kind of understand that. Malnutrition, right, versus undernutrition is a shortage of a specific nutrient. All right. Lipids, protein, vitamin, mineral. If you don't have enough vitamin C, you get scurvy. If you don't have enough protein in your diet, you get something called kwashiorkor. And the child that you see in that picture to the right has kwashiorkor. They don't get enough protein. Eventually, you can get marasmus as a result. If you don't have enough iron in your body, you wind up with something called anemia. So these things have been around for a while. The Green Revolution, that's Norman Borlaug. He was the spearhead of the Green Revolution. So in the Green Revolution, they introduced new technologies, new crop varieties, and new farming practices to help the world feed its population. So it began in the 40s when Norman Borlaug introduced this strain of wheat to Mexican farmers. So it was resistant to disease and it produced a high yield. You got a lot of wheat out of your investment of resources to grow it. Because of Borlaug's wheat, Mexico is able to triple its wheat production. And they use similar practices in India and Pakistan. Okay. If you take that Green Revolution in terms of, crop varieties, developing countries wound up using some industrialized agricultural methods. So synthetic fertilizers, fossil fuel machinery rather than horse-drawn or human-drawn, pesticides, and intensive irrigation methods. So the result of that is you have developing countries like India, right, where they a huge portion of their population was starving. They were suffering from undernutrition. Now, because of these practices and techniques that started with Borlaug, they are exporting grain. They have more than what they need, so they are able to sell it and make money from it, which is a good thing because it helps a country develop. So, the Green Revolution increased food production by 48% per person, but we only increased land use by 11%. So we are getting more and preserving biodiversity, but the methods in the Green Revolution are fertilizer intense, pesticide intense, and we wind up degrading the soil and the environment, kind of like what we talked about in the previous chapter. And we're also increasing air pollution. So it's a cost-benefit analysis. We don't have people starving, but we are degrading the environment. What's the right thing to do? We talked about conventional industrial agriculture, right? So we got monoculture, which is going to increase efficiency. So we're going to get a lot more of that crop. But because it's monoculture, we're going to reduce biodiversity. And then when you have swaths of the same crop, if a disease or a pest comes through, it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet for this pest, right? So it's just going to eat, and destroy the entire crop. So monoculture is efficient, but it doesn't help us with biodiversity. And if a disease or a pest comes, you've lost your whole crop, which is a problem. Back to the idea of sustainable agriculture. You mimic a natural ecosystem. How do you do that, right? You reduce fossil fuel use and then pollution in all of its various forms. What can you do? You can increase organic farming, which we're going to talk about towards the end. Use better technology and use GM crops, which decrease the need for fertilizers and that kind of thing, which is a hot topic we're going to talk about. We've talked about this since the very beginning, right? If we look at ways to reduce our ecological footprint, one of the things that we've talked about is to decrease our animal product consumption in terms of milk and meat, eggs, other animal products. As the world has gotten wealthier, right, as the standard of living across the world has gone up, the ability to afford meat has gone up as well. All right. So per capita meat consumption has gone up tremendously since the 1960s, mostly because standards of living have gone up around the planet. We talked about this when we talked about ecology. We talked about the 10% rule, right? So only about 10% of the energy from one level moves to the next level. So when you're eating meat, it takes a bunch of energy to raise the crops to feed it, and only about 10% of that energy from, the producer level is going to make its way to that consumer. So most of the energy that goes into growing the grain and the grass to feed the cow is gone. It doesn't make its way up. And we've talked about this. Eating lower on the food chain, a vegan or a vegetarian diet is going to be more energy efficient. It's going to reduce our ecological footprint because fewer resources have to go into raising that animal, okay, than if we just eat vegan. It's hard. It's hard because I understand that, we like our meat and our eggs and our cheese, but it's one way we can individually make a difference. Okay. This chart kind of definitely shows how much needs to go into an organism, right, or an animal-based product to get a kilogram of edible output, right? So for a cow, a kilogram of beef takes 20 kilograms of feed to make that kilogram of beef, all right? It takes more than 7 kilograms to make a kilogram of pork, 4.5 to make a kilogram of eggs, just under 3 to make a kilogram of chicken, and just over a kilogram to make a kilogram of milk, okay? So if you want to make a difference, but you really still like your meat and your animal products, try to stay down here, right, in the eggs, chicken, milk zone rather than the pork and beef zone. Sometimes, I get it, you just need steak or you just need a hamburger. I'm exactly the same way, but hopefully this little tidbit might be a good incentive to maybe have it less frequently. And then it takes, if we're just talking about, I was just talking about feed, but if we look at the land required, the water required, and the greenhouse gas emissions that are released in the production of that kilogram of each of those things, beef is quadruple, right, or more than the next thing closest to it. Which is why when we calculated ecological footprint, the more meat you eat, the higher your ecological footprint is going to be. When we raise animals, we raise them in a lot of cases on high density animal farming or feedlots. They're called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. And we've talked about them when we talked about eutrophication. So when we have these CAFOs, normally it's cattle for beef, dairy cows, pigs or hogs or poultry. And this is, a CAFO for chicken. They have environmental issues associated with them. In a CAFO, the organisms that live there are confined, or they don't have a whole lot of room for either part of their life cycle or all of their life cycle. They're kind of squished in, like you can see in the pictures here. When organisms live in conditions like this, they're frequently disease. If you get a sickness that runs through, the hog farm, like you see in the top picture, you're going to wind up with lots and lots of animals getting sick. So they give these animals antibiotics to keep the disease spread under control, and they wind up giving them nutrient supplements to deal with the fact that they're not getting as much natural food as possible. So they wind up suffering from malnutrition. So they take care of that. So an economic benefit of the CAFO, right? You minimize land costs. So you don't have to worry as much about land rather than having a whole lot of land to get your product out of it. Feeding efficiency goes up too, right? Instead of having them spread out over this big wide area, you have them concentrated, so you wind up not having to feed them in as much of an area. And it increases the fraction of food energy that goes into the body mass. So it reduces the waste that's created, when you raise, like we saw in that previous diagram, when you raise cows or beef or pork. Okay. So there are some benefits to it. Of course, there are environmental drawbacks. Okay. When you have antibiotics given en masse more frequently than they're needed, you wind up developing bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. This is why we have stuff in humans like MRSA, because we've used antibiotics too much over the course of time. And you can develop antibiotic resistant bacteria on these CAFOs. And this is just a little explanation of how that happens. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the pesticide treadmill. It's the same idea. You get rampant diseases, right? Like mad cow disease. So these are just, an explanation of how mad cow disease works and how, we deal with it. Waste disposal is another huge thing. The average CAFO produces the amount of manure that a town of 5,000 humans would produce. So one farm produces a town worth 5,000 people's worth of poop. So what do you do with it? They have a lot of these waste ponds. They had a lot of them in North Carolina. And I think it was Hurricane Michael that came through North Carolina. It flooded the area and a lot of these ponds overflowed. So you had a lot of surface water and groundwater contamination from these ponds overflowing. When you get a really good storm, it can very easily happen. So this is, a little bit of an issue, like the details about one CAFO in Michigan. Okay, some of the issues with it. Ethically, okay, we talk about animal rights as well as we talk about human rights. This pork one, really hits home for me. This is the pig's life. They don't get very much further than this from the time, that they're pulled away from their mother until they die. Ethically, is that right to put organisms in those kind of conditions? That's up to you guys to decide. If we look at the nutritional content of the food that animals in a CAFO are given versus, free range animals, free range animals are going to get grass, and you're going to wind up, with better quality meat as a result. If you're in a CAFO, what you wind up with isn't as healthy. So buying free range is more expensive, but if you're going to eat your meat, it's probably more healthful for you. So we talked about rangelands. This is the most common use of land in the United States. It's just free range grazing. The animals go out, they do their thing. It's just open land. There are some rangelands that you can see spread around the world. Okay. The rangelands are these dots. No surprise, most of the rangeland is off in the western half of the United States. Not a whole lot of rangeland around here. Some down in Florida, but really not much on the East Coast. Why is grazing and free range, pasture raised beef better? Why is it a better system? Ungulates, so that sheep, cows, goats, can be raised on land that's too dry to farm. So this land that you see in this picture is too dry to farm. But these animals can eat the crops that are there, eat the natural grasses and stuff that are there. It uses less fossil fuel energy than feedlots, because you don't have to grow the crops to feed them. You just kind of turn them out and they go and they eat. So that's a benefit for grazing. Environmentally, rangelands are susceptible to fire because they tend to be in drier areas. So you can have these areas burn rather quickly and rather frequently because they are too dry for crops. If you wind up overgrazing rangelands, the stream bank is going to erode because there's nothing to hold the soil in place. Clearly, if you have rangeland, you don't have the cows contained or the sheep or the goats contained or the pigs in an area. So they are going to poop out in the pasture. And when they do, that's going to run off and could potentially cause eutrophication in surface waters. And could then percolate into groundwater. We talked about this in the last chapter. We talked about overgrazing, right? So if you graze too much, you get rid of that cover that keeps the soil in place. It's more susceptible to wind erosion. The soil can't hold water at that point, and you're going to have a decrease in biodiversity. So it's a very delicate balance between the right amount of grazing on rangeland and overgrazing. You have to be very aware of it. This is one thing that overgrazing can do. So this is before you start grazing in terms of the biodiversity. After grazing and overgrazing, you're not going to have as much diversity and as much of the natural ecosystem that remains. So there's a balance somewhere. You just have to find it. So why is it that reducing your meat consumption would be a good idea, right? And we kind of talked about this. It reduces carbon dioxide, methane, and NOx emissions based on the resources needed to grow that animal. It conserves water. You have fewer antibiotics and growth hormones that are used. It also improves the topsoil because you don't have as much grazing. And then we talked about the ethical concerns about the treatment of the animals especially in the CAFOs. Another way that we can raise meat is through something called aquaculture. Because we are overfishing, right, which we talked about in chapter 16, we're doing something instead called aquaculture. So it's basically fish farms and oyster farms. We're taking wild organisms and we're growing them in an aquatic farm, okay? It's controlled. So it might be a solution to overfishing and the increased demand for seafood. We are growing lots of things through aquaculture. Most of it's fish and followed by aquatic plants, so seaweed, kelp, that kind of thing. And it's gone up a lot in, the last 2/3 of my lifetime. Again, with every method, every solution that we have for some of these environmental issues, we're going to look at costs and benefits, right? So aquaculture is an easy way to increase food supply and protein sources. If you're not going to eat cow or chicken or pork, you can eat fish is a huge common source of protein. And if you have reliable access to this food, your food security is going to increase. It's also going to wind up decreasing the stress on the wild fish populations. And it's also going to decrease bycatch, like we talked about in chapter 16. So that's a good thing. That's some of the benefit. The cost, again, if it's really big scale industrialized aquaculture, we're going to have to use antibiotics, right? Which is going to cause the bacterial resistance to the antibiotics. depending on where you do it and the size, the scope at which you do it, you're going to destroy native coastal ecosystems. Disease is going to spread, or some of those species, if they get out of the aquaculture pens and out of the farm, they can become invasive as they wind up escaping into the ecosystem. They're bred to survive better, and you wind up with invasive species, which isn't a good thing for the natural ecosystem. So the first genetically modified animal to become approved for human consumption is a salmon that grows faster and bigger than a wild salmon. So the top is the GMO salmon, and the bottom is the natural salmon. That thing is huge, just huge. And if this thing, the big thing, got out into the wild, it's going to completely outcompete these smaller native fish. Crop diversity is really important. We talked about monoculture and how it's dangerous because of its susceptibility to pests and disease. This is kind of a scary statistic. About 90% of the food that we eat comes from 15 crop species and 8 livestock species. We're putting all of our metaphorical agricultural eggs in only a few baskets. So it's important to do what we can to maintain that genetic diversity, okay, as a way to combat disease and pests that could come. So we're looking at going back to some of our more natural, older species, right? So you can look at the different kinds of maize from Mexico, the different kinds of potatoes. If you're planting this variety of either maize or potato, if you have a disease come through, some are going to be spared, which is going to increase your food security. We are also setting up seed banks. So there's a doomsday seed vault in Norway that's built down into the permafrost, and it contains seeds from all over the world, just in case we have some awful pestilence, climate change happening. We've preserved enough agricultural biodiversity in this doomsday seed vault, which is kind of interesting. Last chapter, we talked about the importance of pollinators, and we're going to revisit them again. Honeybees and other insects provide $15 billion in pollination services, one of the big ecosystem services that we need to survive. But bee populations are declining really steeply across North America. And I told you guys in the last lecture the story about me crossing my yard to my neighbors and having to pay attention to where the honeybees are. Whereas now, Erin goes outside to play in the clover in the yard, and she doesn't really see a bee. It's way less common to see a bee. So where is it coming from? Insecticide application. Okay, so they are dying because of pesticides. As the world shrinks, as the world gets smaller, not physically smaller, but metaphorically smaller, parasites and pathogens wind up getting introduced, foreign diseases that wind up being the end of the bee population. And, we also lose flowers like the clover because of how we maintain farms and lawns. So we're losing bee habitat and bee food supplies. And that all kind of comes together to make something called colony collapse disorder. A third of all honeybees each year are dying, and we're not really doing much about it. The main causes are the factors that we had just talked about. One thing that you can do is plant wildflowers. Ask your local horticulturalists. They'll tell you what works and what will grow natively without much effort and input to allow pollinators to have a place to go. A lot of times in the medians of the highway or along the sides of the highway, they'll grow flower fields like this, wildflower fields, to allow pollinators to have space to do their thing. Okay, so we're going to talk about pests and weeds, right? A pest is any organism of any kind that is going to damage crops or livestock. And a weed is a plant that competes with crops. So monocultures, when we have talked about them, they make it more difficult for natural enemies to control a pest population. So because we plant swaths of the same thing, you're less likely to have natural methods work to get rid of pests. So we have to, in order to have enough food to feed the human population, we have to control that chemically. So a pesticide is any synthetic chemical that is going to kill an insect, which we call that specific pesticide an insecticide. A plant, it's an herbicide, or a fungus, which is a fungicide. About 400 million kilograms of these ingredients from pesticides are applied in the United States every year. That is a lot of pesticide, a lot of stuff that's hitting the crops that we wind up eating. They boost food production, right? Because you're allowing them to grow without being impeded by diseases or pests. But there are also negative impacts, okay? So farm workers, the people who are working on the farms, have the highest levels of exposure because they are applying it, right? And if you look at it in terms of ethnic and racial groups, the people who wind up impacted by these things are of a particular ethnic group, right? So is that necessarily fair? As consumers, we ingest the residue when we eat non-organic produce, which is why they tell you to wash your soy or wash your produce before you eat it. Pesticides also wind up killing non-target organisms, which you can see, like the monarch population has reduced milkweed. So using Roundup has reduced the milkweed population, which then has reduced the monarch population. So we're aware of it now and things are getting better, but if there's no milkweed, they have no place to lay their eggs. And milkweed grows in a lot of cases in the transition zone between like a road and the field, a Roundup treated field. I've actually seen these. If you go to the Home Depot and you get like flowers or vegetables or anything, if you look at the little plastic stake that comes in with it, it'll tell you that chemicals called neonicotinoids, okay, exist, and some of the plants that you buy at places like the Home Depot are used on them. So they make the plant toxic to insects that feed on them. So that's good because you won't have pests feeding on them, but it's going to wind up killing pollinators, right? Or killing predatory insects that feed on the pests that would feed on the plants. They can also get into the water supply and kill other organisms that don't pose any threat to the crops. So you preserve your I saw it on marigold. You preserve your marigolds, right? So the deer might not eat them or whatever, but it can cause all sorts of issues for natural pest control. This is a huge idea, right? It goes back hand in hand with our idea of bacterial resistance to antibiotics. So pests are naturally going to evolve resistance to pesticides. So, and this is the truth. You have chemical pesticides. The more you use them, the less effective they become as resistance develops. So if you look at it, right, you apply, you've got these locusts attacking the crops. So they apply a pesticide, right? It kills most of the pests, but in terms of their genetics, you have a few pests who have a genetic resistance to that pesticide, right? So these guys are going to survive. Kills most of them, but a handful of the pests have a genetic resistance to that pesticide, right? So these guys are going to survive. They're going to survive. They're going to reproduce, right? And you're going to have a bigger part of the population with that gene that is resistant to that pesticide. So they're going to reproduce, and the farmer's going to see all of these guys, these pests, oh, they're back. They're going to apply the same pesticide, but it's not going to kill the bugs. It's not going to kill the pest, right? So you need to then develop the bigger, better pesticide to kill these pests. And then the process is going to repeat again and again and again. So what they call this is the pesticide treadmill. Eventually, the pesticide becomes effective or ineffective, and then you have to develop a new one. And then that one becomes ineffective and you develop a new one, which causes lots of issues. You're constantly having to put more and more resources and energy and, frankly, money into developing new pesticides that are more toxic to kill the pests. One thing you could do is introduce a biological control. And we saw this with the cane grub and the cane toad. You introduce an organism to eliminate a pest. It worked. They did it in Australia with the cactus moth. So it was able to control the prickly pear cactus population in Australia, okay, before and after. But it's not always successful. You can wind up having that species become invasive. All right. You can use a Bt bacterium to allow crops to produce a poison that poisons the beetles and caterpillars when they eat the plant. What does that do to humans when they eat that plant? Has yet to be determined at this point. And, I just talked about this. The non-native species, can then become invasive. It worked really well in Australia, the cactus moth, but it spread to the United States. Okay. And was used in Caribbean countries also, but it's now spread to the United States, and it's consuming native cacti, which is decreasing the cacti biodiversity. So what's the solution? How do you do this? Biological controls can get out of control. Chemical controls can wind up creating the pesticide treadmill. What do? You do something called integrated pest management, and it's a bunch of different factors. You can do biocontrols, you can do chemical pesticides, you can do habitat alteration, and you can do lots of the things that we talked about in the previous chapter: crop rotation, GMOs, different till methods, and mechanical pest removals. Okay. So you look at a particular circumstance and you look at what the pests are, and you do what you can to get rid of the pest, but also be concerned and aware of the natural underpinnings of agriculture that we talked about in the previous chapter. Okay. Part of that is using GMOs. All right, so we know what genetic engineering is when when scientists manipulate an organism's DNA. A genetically modified food is something that comes from a genetically modified organism where genetic engineering has happened with that organism's DNA. All right. So what they did to create Roundup Ready soybeans or Roundup Ready canola or any of the things that we've talked about, they take some bacterial DNA, usually they pull it out, they put the gene of interest into it, and they make that plant resistant to Roundup or resistant to a virus or resistant to a pesticide, anything like that, okay? So that gene gets transferred to the target organism, which in this case is corn or soybeans or canola. We do something called traditional breeding or selective breeding. Genetically altering plants is similar to artificial selection. So when we have created all the different breeds of dogs, right? We are choosing specific traits and crossing organisms to breed them for that specific trait. Whereas when we do genetic engineering, we are pulling different species DNA in. And the combinations we get using genetic engineering is more specific and more direct rather than if we had done selective breeding. So we'll talk a little bit about golden rice when we look at the key concepts, the key points. These are just some ways that we have looked at GM crops and how biotechnology is making a difference in the things that we raise to consume for food and fiber. Okay. BT corn, biotech soybeans, that kind of thing. So if we talk about GMOs, 5 countries account for most of the GM crops, right? So most of what is grown in the world is soybeans, followed by corn, and we grow most of it. Is it beneficial to farms and the environment, or is it risky? I think the jury is still out on that. We don't have enough information yet. So benefits of GM crops, because we have to look at the benefits and the costs. They've been engineered to really increase insect resistance and herbicide tolerance. So that's going to be beneficial to industrial farms, not so much the smaller farmers. Because these are herbicide tolerant and insect resistant, you can get a lot higher yield. Okay. So you enhance food security, you reduce poverty, you get more yield out of your land. So you don't have to look at ways to spread your acreage for farming. If they're drought resistant, you wind up using less water, which is a benefit for our water usage, considering that agriculture uses most of the water that we use. You can genetically modify crops to contain key nutrients, which is going to deal with malnutrition, like the golden rice that we're going to talk about. And you reduce pesticide application, so you're reducing pollution. So, what is bad about a GM crop? How could it be considered bad? Okay. This is more stuff that's pro-GMO. Okay. One downside is that a lot of weeds that we're using, because we're using, more herbicides, are becoming resistant to it. So then you have to apply more and more and more and more, which is a downside. A risk of GM crops. Okay. So far, the research that we have seen doesn't really show significant health hazards as a result of consuming genetically engineered crops, right? There's no data that says it causes hazards to human health. From an ecological standpoint, right? If we have GMOs interbreeding with wild relatives, you're going to introduce super weeds into wild populations, which can cause an issue. And we talked about the precautionary principle when we were in chapter 13. Be careful with it. Don't assume it's safe, right? Assume that it's unhealthy until we have data to tell us otherwise. But that's not what we're doing. We're definitely following the innocent until proven guilty approach. Publicly, what are some of the issues other than those that we talked about? We all rely on food, right? So if GMOs and genetic engineering are a thing, everybody is reliant on biotech products to consume food. Okay. From an economic standpoint, a lot of the crops that we use are that are genetically modified are only controlled by a certain number of companies. So these guys have the monopoly on it. Monsanto is one of the biggest ones. Okay. Biotech companies can patent their seed. And when we look at that Monsanto piece, we're gonna look at a clip of it. So if, with the two guys we talked about, Marsh and Baxter, if it was the seed that made its way from the GMO farm to the non-GMO farm, because the non-GMO farm, the organic farm, hadn't paid for those seeds, when he harvested the crop, he couldn't plant his own seeds. He could get sued because he didn't pay Monsanto for it, which is, an issue. And it's something out of both farmers' control. So is it fair? Is it not fair? Lots of countries force you to label foods that are GMO, but we don't in the United States. It's come up frequently as a topic of debate and legislation, but it hasn't made its way through because of lobbying by the biotech companies that we had mentioned in a couple slides before. So it's not labeled, although you will find some things that say made through genetic modification on like granola bars and stuff. So organic or agriculture is a potential solution. If you're trying to avoid pests and that kind of a thing, and all of those other pitfalls of industrial agriculture, one thing you can do is buy organic. If it's designated organic, it's grown with practices that don't include synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, hormones, or antibiotics. And the Organic Food Production Act of 1990 came up with a national standard by which food can be labeled as organic. So if it's labeled as organic, it hits all of the criteria based on the Organic Food Production Act of 1990. Organic food is expensive. And, if you've ever been to the grocery store and you've seen it, it costs anywhere between 10 and 30% more than conventional products. Organic milk can be twice as much. And this is what the criteria that it has to follow in order to be organic crops or organic livestock. So if you guys want to take a look at that, you can. It's more of a thing now. Organic agriculture is more of a thing now than it has really been in the last 10 years, or definitely in the last 20 years. So most retail grocery stores have an organic section, which is good. Production and demand has gone up. So it's more of a thing now. Can it feed the world? It's possible. If we don't waste as much food, and if we consume less meat, and if technology improves, lots of ifs, but organic agriculture is definitely a way to feed the world with less environmental impact. In order to have sustainable agriculture happen, to produce our food sustainably, there's a lot that has to go in it, right? Biotech kind of needs to play a role, right? But we have issues that make it more difficult, right? Moving away from industrial agriculture to organic agriculture. Well, that's going to increase prices. So is that going to decrease food security, right? So there's a lot that goes into it. Some other challenges are listed here, right? We need fossil fuels. We're losing crop diversity and pollinators. We're using too much water. We're not careful with our soil. We're producing more greenhouse gas emissions, which is going to set up potentially a negative climate change impact. What can we do? Farmers markets and CSAs, community supported agriculture. Instead of, hitting the regular grocery store, you shop locally, which is also going to reduce your ecological footprint. Because you don't have to worry about how far your produce comes from. You buy locally. Yeah, we're going to skip that one. Again, goes back to this. Sustainable agriculture mimics a natural ecosystem. So you use negative feedback loops, those balancing loops, to help us do our agriculture in order to feed our population, but to do it in a sustainable way. So this is just an example of how they farm rice in Japan. All right. They use ducks to eat weeds. So it's a biocontrol, right? The poop that the ducks do fertilizes the water. They oxygenate it, right? When it's time to, for the rice to come to grain, they get rid of the ducks. They sell the ducks. And you wind up with not as many pests, right? So 2 hectares of paddies like that can produce a lot of stuff. So it's possible. But again, just like lots of things that we've said throughout the course of this course, there is no one size fits all solution. You have to look at what's there and make the best decisions based on the circumstances. So that's the end of Unit 7.